This is the story of the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot. Background. In 1921, Oklahoma had a racially, socially, and politically tense atmosphere. The war had ended in 1819 with the return of many ex-servicemen. The Civil War was still in living memory, even though it had ended in 1865. Prohibition had come into force the previous year, 1920, ushering in a new era of lawlessness. Civil rights for disenfranchised peoples were poor, and the Ku Klux Klan had seen a recent resurgence. Tulsa, as a booming oil city, supported a large number of affluent, educated, and professional African Americans. This combination of factors each played a part in the rising tensions which was to culminate in the coming events. The territory of northern Oklahoma had been established for resettlement of Native Americans from the southeast, some of whom had owned slaves. Other areas had received many settlers from the south, whose families had been slaveholders before the American Civil War. It was admitted as a state on November 16, 1907. The newly created state legislature passed racial segregation laws, commonly known as Jim Crow laws, as one of its first orders of business. Its 1907 Constitution and laws had voter registration rules that effectively disenfranchised most blacks. This also barred them from serving on juries or in local office, a situation that whites enforced until after passage of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the early 20th century, lynchings were common in Oklahoma as a part of a continuing effort by whites to assert and maintain white supremacy. Between the declaration of statehood and the riot 13 years later, at least 31 persons were lynched in Oklahoma. 26 were black, and nearly all were men or boys. During the 20 years following the riot, the number of known lynchings statewide fell to just 2. On August 4, 1916, Tulsa passed an ordinance that mandated residential segregation by forbidding blacks or whites from residing on any block where 3/4 or more of the residents were of the other race. Although the United States Supreme Court declared the ordinance unconstitutional the next year, the city refused to remove it from the books. As returning veterans tried to re-enter the labor market following World War I, social tension and anti-black sentiment increased in cities where job competition was high. At the same time, black veterans pushed to have their civil rights enforced, believing they had earned full citizenship by military service. In what became known as the Red Summer of 1919, industrial cities across the Midwest and North experienced severe race riots, most often led against blacks by recent immigrant groups who often competed with blacks for low-paying jobs. In Chicago and some other cities, blacks defended themselves for the first time with force, but were often outnumbered. Northeastern Oklahoma was in an economic slump that increased unemployment. Since 1915, the Ku Klux Klan had been growing in urban chapters across the country. Its first significant appearance in Oklahoma occurred on August 12, 1921. By the end of 1921, Tulsa had 3,200 residents in the Klan by one estimate. The city's population was 72,000 in 1920. The predominantly black district of Greenwood in Tulsa had a commercial district so prosperous that it was known as the Negro Wall Street, now commonly referred to as the Black Wall Street. Blacks had created their own businesses and services in this enclave, including several grocers, 2 newspapers, 2 movie theaters, nightclubs, and numerous churches. Black professionals, including doctors, dentists, lawyers, and clergy, served their peers. Because of residential segregation in the city, most classes of blacks lived together in Greenwood. They selected their own leaders and raised capital there to support economic growth. In the surrounding areas of northeastern Oklahoma, blacks also enjoyed relative prosperity and participated in the oil boom. Monday, May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day. Encounter in the elevator. It is alleged that at some time about or after 4 p.m., 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a black shoe shiner employed at a Main Street shine parlor, entered the only elevator of the nearby Drexel building at 319 South Main Street to use the top floor restroom, which was restricted to black people. He encountered Sarah Page, the 17-year-old white elevator operator on duty. The two likely knew each other, at least by sight, as this building was the only one nearby with a restroom to which Rowland had expressed permission to use, and the elevator operated by Page was the only one in the building. A clerk at Renberg's, a clothing store on the first floor of the Drexel, heard what sounded like a woman's scream and saw a young black man rushing from the building. The clerk went to the elevator and found Page in what he said was a distraught state. Thinking she had been assaulted, he summoned the authorities. Brief investigation. Although the police likely questioned Page, no written account of her statement has been found. It is generally accepted that the police determined what happened between the two teenagers was something less than an assault. The authorities conducted a low-key investigation rather than launching a manhunt for her alleged assailant. Afterward, Page told the police that she would not press charges. Regardless of whether assault had occurred, Rowland had reason to be fearful. At the time, such an accusation alone put him at risk for attack by whites. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Rowland fled to his mother's house in the Greenwood neighborhood. Tuesday, May 31st, 1921. Suspect arrested. On the morning after the incident, Detective Henry Carmichael and Henry C. Pack, a black patrolman, located Rowland on Greenwood Avenue and detained him. Pack was one of the two black officers on the city's police force, which had then included about 45 officers. Rowland was initially taken to the Tulsa City Jail at First and Main. Later that day, Police Commissioner J.M. Atkinson said he had received an anonymous telephone call threatening Rowland's life. He ordered Rowland transferred to the more secure jail on the top floor of the Tulsa County Courthouse. Rowland was well known among attorneys and other legal professionals within the city, many of whom knew Rowland through his work as a shoe shiner. Some witnesses later recounted hearing several attorneys defend Rowland in their conversations with one another. One of the men said, "Why, I know that boy, and have known him a good while. That's not in him." Standoff at the Courthouse. The afternoon edition of the Tribune hit the streets shortly after 3 p.m., and soon news spread of a potential lynching. By 4 p.m., local authorities were on alert. White people began congregating at and near the Tulsa County Courthouse. By sunset at 7:34 p.m., the several hundred white people assembled outside the courthouse appeared to have the makings of a lynch mob. Willard M. McAuliffe, the newly elected sheriff of Tulsa County, was determined to avoid events such as the 1920 lynching of a white murder suspect, Roy Belton, in Tulsa, which had occurred during the term of his predecessor. The sheriff took steps to ensure the safety of Rowland. McAuliffe organized his deputies into a defensive formation around Rowland, who was terrified. The sheriff positioned 6 of his men, armed with rifles and shotguns, on the roof of the courthouse. He disabled the building's elevator and had his remaining men barricade themselves at the top of the stairs, with orders to shoot any intruders on sight. The sheriff went outside and tried to talk the crowd into going home, but to no avail. According to an account by Scott Ellsworth, the sheriff was hooted down. About 8:20 p.m., 3 white men entered the courthouse, demanding that Rowland be turned over to them. Although vastly outnumbered by the growing crowd on the street, Sheriff McAuliffe turned the men away. A few blocks away on Greenwood Avenue, members of the black community and known criminals associated with underground gambling houses gathered to discuss the situation at Gurley's Hotel. Given the recent lynching of Belton, a white man accused of murder, they believed that Rowland was greatly at risk. Many black residents were determined to prevent the crowd from lynching Rowland, but they were divided about tactics. Young World War I veterans prepared for a battle by collecting guns and ammunition. Older, more prosperous men feared a destructive confrontation that likely would cost them dearly. O.W. Gurley gave a sworn statement to the grand jury that he tried to convince the men that there would be no lynching, but that they had responded that Sheriff McAuliffe had personally told them that their presence was required. About 9:30 p.m., a group of approximately 50 to 60 black men, armed with rifles and shotguns, arrived at the jail to support the sheriff and his deputies to defend Rowland from the mob. Corroborated by 10 witnesses, Attorney James Luther submitted to the grand jury that they were following the orders of Sheriff McAuliffe, who publicly denied he gave any orders. Taking up arms. Having seen the armed black people, some of the more than 1,000 white people at the courthouse went home for their own guns. Others headed for the National Guard Armory at 6th Street and Norfolk Avenue, where they planned to arm themselves. The armory contained a supply of small arms and ammunition. Major James Bell of the 180th Infantry had already learned of the mounting situation downtown and the possibility of a break-in, and he took measures to prevent the same. He called the commanders of the 3 National Guard units in Tulsa, who ordered all the Guard members to put on their uniforms and report quickly to the armory. When a group of white people arrived and began pulling at the grating over a window, Bell went outside to confront the crowd of 300 to 400 men. Bell told them that the Guard members inside were armed and prepared to shoot anyone who tried to enter. After this show of force, the crowd withdrew from the armory. At the courthouse, the crowd had swollen up to nearly 2,000, many of them now armed. Several local leaders, including Reverend Charles W. Kerr, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, tried to dissuade the mob action. The chief of police, John A. Gustafson, later claimed that he tried to talk the crowd into going home. Anxiety on Greenwood Avenue was rising. Many blacks worried about the safety of Rowland. Small groups of armed black men ventured toward the courthouse in automobiles, partly for reconnaissance and to demonstrate they were prepared to take necessary action to protect Rowland. In Greenwood, rumors began to fly. In particular, a report that white men and women were storming the courthouse. Shortly after 10 p.m., a second, larger group of approximately 75 armed black men decided to go to the courthouse. They offered their support to the sheriff, who declined their help. According to witnesses, a white man is alleged to have told one of the armed black men to surrender his pistol. The man refused, and a shot was fired. That first shot may have been accidental or meant as a warning. It was a catalyst for an exchange of gunfire. Riot. The gunshots triggered an almost immediate response by the white men, many of whom fired on the black people, who then fired back at the white people. The first battle was said to last a few seconds or so, but it took a toll, as 10 white people and 2 black people lay dead or dying in the street. The black contingent retreated towards Greenwood. A rolling gunfight ensued. The armed white mob pursued the armed black mob towards Greenwood, with many stopping to loot local stores for additional weapons and ammunition. Along the way, bystanders, many of whom were leaving a movie theater after a show, were caught off guard by the mobs and fled. Panic set in as the white mob began firing on any black people in the crowd. The white mob also shot and killed at least 1 white man in the confusion. At around 11 p.m., members of the Oklahoma National Guard unit began to assemble at the armory to organize a plan to subdue the rioters. Several groups were deployed downtown to set up guard at the courthouse, police station, and other public facilities. Members of the local chapter of the American Legion joined in on the patrols of the street. The forces appeared to have been deployed to protect the white districts adjacent to Greenwood. The National Guard rounded up numerous black people and took them to the convention hall on Brady Street for detention. Many prominent white Tulsans also participated in the riot, including Tulsa founder and KKK member W. Tate Brady, who participated in the riot as a night watchman. It was reported in This Land Press that W. Tate Brady participated and led the tarring and feathering of a group of men. The article states that police delivered the convicted men into the custody of the black-robed Knights of Liberty. At around midnight, white rioters again assembled outside the courthouse. It was a smaller group, but more organized and determined. They shouted in support of a lynching. When they attempted to storm the building, the sheriff and his deputies turned them away and dispersed them. Wednesday, June 1st, 1921. Throughout the early morning hours, groups of armed white and black people squared off in gunfights. At this point, the fighting was concentrated along the sections of the Frisco tracks, a dividing line between the black and white commercial districts. A rumor circulated that more black people were coming by train from Muskogee to help with an invasion of Tulsa. At one point, passengers on an incoming train were forced to take cover on the floor of the train cars, as they had arrived in the midst of crossfire, with the train taking hits on both sides. Small groups of white people made brief forays by car into Greenwood, indiscriminately firing into businesses and residences. They often received return fire. Meanwhile, white rioters threw lighted oil rags into several buildings along Archer Street, igniting them. Fires began. At around 1 a.m., the white mob began setting fires, mainly in businesses on commercial Archer Street at the southern edge of the Greenwood district. As crews from the Tulsa Fire Department arrived to put out fires, they were turned away at gunpoint. By 4 a.m., an estimated 24 black-owned businesses had been set ablaze. As news traveled among Greenwood residents in the early morning hours, many began to take up arms in defense of their neighborhood, while others began a mass exodus from the city. Throughout the night, both sides continued fighting, sometimes only sporadically. Daybreak. Upon sunrise, around 5 a.m., a train whistle sounded. Some rioters believed this sound to be a signal for the rioters to launch an all-out assault on Greenwood. A white man stepped out from behind the Frisco depot and was fatally shot by a sniper in Greenwood. Crowds of rioters poured from their shelter on foot and by car into the streets of the black neighborhood. 5 white men in a car led the charge, but were killed by a fusillade of gunfire before they had traveled 1 block. Overwhelmed by the sheer number of white people, more black people retreated north on Greenwood Avenue to the edge of town. Chaos ensued as terrified residents fled. The rioters shot indiscriminately and killed many residents along the way. Splitting into small groups, they began breaking into houses and buildings, looting. Several black people later testified that white people broke into occupied homes and ordered the residents out onto the street, where they could have been driven or forced to walk to detention centers. A rumor spread among the white people that the new Mount Zion Baptist Church was being used as a fortress and armory. Purportedly 20 caskets full of rifles had been delivered to the church, though no evidence was ever found. Attack by air. Numerous eyewitnesses described airplanes carrying white assailants who fired rifles and dropped firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing families. The privately owned aircraft were dispatched from the nearby Curtis Southwest Field outside Tulsa. Law enforcement officials later said that the planes were to provide reconnaissance and protect against a Negro uprising. Law enforcement personnel were thought to be aboard at least some flights. Eyewitness accounts, such as a testimony from the survivors during the commission hearings and a manuscript by eyewitnesses and attorney Buck Colbert Franklin, discovered in 2015, said that on the morning of June 1st, men in the planes dropped incendiary bombs and fired rifles at black residents. Arrival of National Guard troops. Adjutant General Charles Barrett of the Oklahoma National Guard arrived with 109 troops from Oklahoma City by special train about 9:15 a.m. Ordered in by the governor, he could not legally act until he had contacted all appropriate local authorities, including the mayor, T.D. Evans, the sheriff, and the police chief. Meanwhile, his troops paused to eat breakfast. Barrett summoned reinforcements from several other Oklahoma cities. By this time, thousands of surviving black residents had fled the city. Another 4,000 persons had been rounded up and detained at various centers. Under the martial law established this day, these detainees were required to carry identification cards. Barrett declared martial law at 11:49 a.m., and by noon, the troops had managed to suppress most of the remaining violence. Aftermath. The riot was covered by national newspapers, and the reported number of deaths varies wildly. On June 1st, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune reported that 9 white people and 68 black people had died in the riot, but shortly afterwards, it changed this number to a total of 176 dead. The next day, the same paper reported the count as 9 white people and 21 black people. The New York Times said that 77 people had been killed, including 68 black people, but it later lowered the total to 33. The Oklahoma Department of Vital Statistics count put the number of deaths at 36, 26 black and 10 white. Very few people, if any, died as a direct result of the fire. Official state records recorded only 5 deaths by conflagration for the entire state in the year of 1921. Walter Francis White of the NAACP traveled to Tulsa from New York and reported that, although officials and undertakers said that the fatalities numbered 10 white and 21 colored, he estimated the number of dead to be 50 whites and between 150 and 200 Negroes. He also reported that 10 white men were killed on Tuesday, 6 white men drove into the black section and never came out, and 13 whites were killed on Wednesday. He reported that the head of the Salvation Army in Tulsa said that 37 Negroes were employed as gravediggers to bury 120 Negroes in individual graves without coffins on Friday and Saturday. The Oklahoma Commission report states that it was 150 graves and over 36 gravediggers. Of the some 800 people admitted to local hospitals for injuries, the majority are believed to have been white, as both black hospitals had been burned in the rioting. Additionally, even if the white hospitals had admitted black people because of the riot, against their usual segregation policy, injured blacks had little means to get to these hospitals, which were located across the city from Greenwood. More than 6,000 black Greenwood residents were arrested and detained at 3 local facilities: Convention Hall, the Tulsa City Fairgrounds, and McNulty Park. Property losses. The commercial section of Greenwood was destroyed. Losses included 191 businesses, a junior high school, several churches, and the only hospital in the district. The Red Cross reported that 1,256 houses were burned, and another 215 were looted but not burned. The Tulsa Real Estate Exchange estimated property losses amounting to $1.5 million in real estate and $750,000 in personal property, the equivalent to a total of $32 million today. The Red Cross estimated that 10,000 people, mostly black, were made homeless by the destruction. What does this tell us? What does this riot and the events that led up to it and the aftermath. What does all of this show? And why bring it up now during Black History Month? It's the past, isn't it? Yes, it is. It's the past. It's also the present. This event didn't just happen because a black man allegedly raped or assaulted, as it was said at the time, a white woman. That was just an excuse. That was an excuse to go get guns, to go round up blacks. And blacks, rightfully, wanted to protect their own because there's a history of lynching. There's a history of mob justice for no good goddamn reason. And these people wanted to fight. And as a result, they lost their entire neighborhood. They lost what they had built for themselves at the hands of people who didn't want them to have anything in the first place, didn't want them to be citizens, didn't treat them as human beings, treated them as cattle. This is a recurring narrative over and over and over again. There are some white people in this country that cannot stand to see black men and women rise above the cotton field. They can't stand it. And they want nothing more than blacks to be put back in their place. And that's the underlying message of Make America Great Again. How do you make America great again? You put blacks back in their place. No right to vote, no right to be human. Wash our floors, wash our cars. Raise our children. Satisfy the needs of the man of the house when his pretty little blonde wife isn't at home. You're the help. Act like it. We celebrate Black History Month because blacks have done everything for this country. We've given everything. Our ancestors were stolen from Africa, brought across an ocean into a place they never could have conceived of, made to work in unbelievable conditions, made to interbreed so that slave owners could have more and more powerful men and women to do their bidding, to build their country free of charge. When we weren't deemed necessary anymore, we were freed into a world that didn't see us as human. Would you free your lawnmower? Would you free your weed whacker? How about your washer and dryer? And if you did, would you consider them human? Would you want them to have voting rights? Would you want them to move next door to you? We were free, but we only knew how to do one thing: work for our captors. So we went back to them. We worked for them for a barely livable wage. What we asked for was to be treated as humans, to be treated with dignity and respect, to be given the same rights as everyone else has. Not such a tall order when you consider we worked in your factories, we worked in your homes, we fought your wars for you, all the while being paid less than our white counterparts and being treated as subhuman to boot. Don't drink in our water fountains. Don't go to our restrooms. You can't enter the building the same way we do. And if one of our women happens to fabricate a story about a 14-year-old black boy grabbing her waist and accosting her in her store, then we won't wait for due process and the law. We'll take the law into our own hands. But that's a different story for another time.